As you know, very few startups were successful after dot-com bust. Neotris is one of the successful startups. And Kittu and his Neotris team worked really hard and smart to make Neotris a successful company, and they sold it to NetScreen for $265 million, and which was later acquired by Juniper Networks. Neotris was in clientless VPN technology, and also one of our NITian was kind of indirectly reporting to Kittu. His name is Guruppa Srinivas. Prior to Neotris, Kittu was co-founder of WebMD. He held various executive management positions, and prior to WebMD, he was at Silicon Graphics. He held managerial positions before quitting SGI. On a lighter note, Kittu is a very popular guy on the Twitter, so he's a big fan of Twitter. He has tweeted close to 1450 so far, and he has around like 443 followers. And please, before meeting Kittu and giving a business pitch to Kittu, make sure that you follow his tweets for the last 2 or 3 days so that you can have a good starting conversation with him. So now I would like to invite Kittu to address NITians.
Thank you, Sridhar, for that rather warm introduction. 443 followers doesn't make you a celebrity on Twitter. But thank you very much, folks, for having me out here. Sridhar told me that a lot of previous keynote speakers came out here to share their life stories. And he rightfully pointed out that our life stories with the prevalence of Google is readily available with one search. So I'm not going to bore you with my life story. If there's anything specific you'd like to ask me, I'm happy to answer any questions during the Q&A part of it. But what I thought I'd do is to talk a little bit about what I see as some of the key trends within the IT space, and also clean tech is an area of interest of mine, and I wanted to share with you some of my thoughts there as well. So, I came a little prepared, so please bear with me. So I broadly classify sort of information technology to consumer and enterprise, although that's probably too broad of a classification. Nevertheless, for the purposes of this discussion, that'll have to suffice. You know, one of the interesting things that I see, I'll start with consumer. One of the interesting things that I see on the consumer front is that if you rewind back to, say, the last 15, 20 years, there have been a few sort of tectonic shifts. Back, I'd say, in the early to mid-80s, you had the PC as a major tectonic shift. And then came along the internet as we know it, thanks to my mentor and friend, Jim Clark, who started Netscape. And then came along search as another major shift from information technology point of view. And essentially organizing data into information, unstructured data into information. And now we have upon us, almost simultaneously, several very interesting shifts. One is obviously social media, and second is mobile. And mobile is a particularly interesting one when you think about it in the context of the emerging markets. And in the context of media, there is video that has really changed the world quite a bit. So I'd say, today we are at the cross-section of social media and mobile. And I think that's a very interesting cross-section. And why I pointed out these, why I talked about, PC to internet to search to social media, is because if you look at it, a lot of products and services that existed in each era kind of got replicated in subsequent eras, right? So if you had, say, productivity applications in sort of the PC world, they kind of got replicated into the browser world. And if you had community applications, same thing happened there. And with every new era, there's been some twist that's taken advantage of a new technology or a new environment, but it's at the core essence, it's sort of remained the same. Even something like dating is a very interesting application that existed in the PC world when you had things like Prodigy and AOL and things like that. But then came along, in the internet world, you've got Match.com, or for those of us of Indian origin, the Bharat Matrimonies of the world, or the Shadi.coms. And then now you've got, in the social media context, you have, Zoosk and various eHarmonies and various other kind of things that are trying to take advantage of the existence of a social graph. So that's an interesting opportunity for one to look for white spaces and create, and try to essentially replicate the playbook from the previous era. And I think there's been a lot of companies that have successfully done that. And, today we see, all sorts of innovations, even from a business model point of view, which probably didn't exist in previous generations. Obviously transaction and subscription-based business models have existed. Advertising is one that search actually kind of made very trendy. Advertising existed before that, but kind of had a meteoric rise and a meteoric fall as well. But Google kind of made it popular once again, although I have to say that Google probably cornered most of the value out of at least search-based advertising. And what I thought I'd share with you is, and let me talk a little bit about it from the enterprise side of things. What I see there is, I see consumerization of enterprise IT. There was a time when enterprise customers essentially kind of drove the innovation. And it had a lot to do with cost of customer acquisition. And let me say what I mean by that. Now, if you rewind back to, again, 15, 20 years ago, cost of customer acquisition was pretty expensive. And so most vendors, what they did was, they started with, because if you had to go build a consumer-oriented product, like a Sony or then Apple or Microsoft or Intel or whoever, there was a lot of, or rather Dell or whoever, there was a lot of marketing expense that you had to put, because you had to go through traditional channels, whether that be television or radio or newspaper, to recruit customers. And that ended up being pretty expensive. And so what a lot of vendors preferred to do was, not that they excluded consumer, but they preferred to focus on the enterprise. And even within the enterprise, they focus on the large enterprise and then swim downstream from there, right? Just because if I'm going to spend $100 to acquire a customer, I might as well spend it on somebody I can squeeze the maximum out of, right? So that was the sort of the rationale behind it. And so the large enterprise customer typically drove the innovation, and they were demanding customers. So most vendors spent a lot of time with them, and product efforts essentially became project efforts over a period of time. But then over a period of time, they swam down to the mid-market and so on. There were a few exceptions which started off in the mid-market, but it's very difficult. What I found is it's very difficult to swim upstream than it was at least to swim downstream. Now, that has changed in a revolutionary sort of way. What I mean by that is, if you now think about it from a cost of customer acquisition point of view, that has dropped precipitously, right? So no longer does a vendor have to focus on just the large enterprise. they can actually build a very successful business focusing almost exclusively on the mid-market, or for that matter, on the consumer, right? I'll give you an example of one of our portfolio companies, Data Domain. Data Domain, we started in our offices with about 250K. We ended up investing about 17 million in the company. And when I was running Neoteris, Frank Slutman, who was the CEO of Data Domain, had just gotten hired, and one of the things that he reached out to me and asked me for is, can you share with me your thoughts on how you went about building your channel and your distribution? And we talked about it, but one of the things that he did, which I thought was a very smart move, was he focused almost exclusively on the mid-market at the expense of excluding the large enterprise from their go-to-market. And he did that because he felt like he was building a data center product. We were different. We were building an edge of the network product. He was building a data center product, and he felt like to meet the demands of a large enterprise would be almost prohibitively expensive, and they would just drag the company down. And so they focused on the mid-market, went through first initially a single-tier channel, and their cost of customer acquisition there was much lower. And obviously, they didn't monetize that customer as much, but were very successful in building a pretty large company. Another two examples I'll give you that employed a similar go-to-market are Salesforce.com and WebEx. In fact, Salesforce.com and WebEx did it in a much more grassroots sort of way than even Data Domain did. What they did was, they said, Salesforce.com said, you can use Salesforce.com, pay for it yourself using your credit card. WebEx did the same thing. It said, instead of traveling to your customer, why don't you just use a WebEx and do a customer meeting that way? And it was only later that the unwitting IT guy saw the expense reports coming in and said, oh, wait a minute, I'm spending so much on Salesforce.com or WebEx, let me go out and get an enterprise license. So that was a case where the cost of customer acquisition was so easy, and that was because the tools were available, whether it was search or internet or whatever, those tools were available that dropped the cost of customer acquisition, made it much more cost effective to acquire that mid-market customer and still monetize that customer enough. And now with social media, that's become even easier. I mean, one of the things that I find pretty entertaining is, the Zappos CEO puts out a tweet almost every day about some product that they're selling, right? And he's got a huge following of people who listen to what he has to say. But that's a way of actually marketing. One of our companies, Groupon, is a classic example of another kind of business model innovation. Innovation on the customer acquisition side of things, which is essentially using people to generate some sort of virality. If you want to get a product at a discount, but it's only available if you can gather 10 other friends, boy, are we incented to go off and do that, right? So that's an example of how the world has changed from what it used to be about 15, 20 years ago, and it's all centered around cost of customer acquisition. And so that's what I mean when I say that there's essentially in the enterprise space, you're seeing this consumerization of IT happening. It's not complete by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, think about it. Most of us sitting in this room are still wedded to our Outlook and things like that, although we know that it's a sucky experience, right? So that's one interesting thing. So the thing I wanted to also point out was that the US used to be sort of the innovation center of the world even when it came to enterprise IT. And I think that's changing some. It's definitely changed quite a bit over the last, I'd say, decade or so. There are lots of very interesting companies that have emerged out of Israel or Europe or even now India and China. And that's one of the